Okay, so like I said, we're just going to do deism tonight, which is probably good because there's actually quite a bit to say about deism. Now, here's what I'm going to try to avoid just doing a complete rehash of the chapter. You guys can read, you're intelligent people, but what I do want to do is kind of draw out a few things from the chapter to kind of really sit on, and then I want to spend the majority of our time processing moralistic therapeutic deism. Because if you look at the index or the contents of the book, the chapters that we're going to process, we've done Christian theism, right? We've talked about deism. You read the chapter on that. If you were a good student, you read the chapter on naturalism, even though we're not going to talk about that tonight. We'll talk about that next week. Then you have nihilism, existentialism, Eastern pantheistic monism, the New Age, which is spirituality without religion, postmodernism, Islamic theism. Those are the ones that are kind of coming up. And I would argue that deism, and specifically the subset of deism, moralistic therapeutic deism, and then chapter 8, the New Age, spirituality without religion, are the two that you will encounter the most unless you are in a specifically unique Islamic situation, or you have a lot of, Islamic friends or something like that, or you know a lot of people in another group. But moralistic therapeutic deism, and then kind of the pendulum swinging even further of just having no religion, everyone kind of do what they want, there's no grand design or anything, those two are probably the most prominent that we will encounter just in conversation with people, in people's ideology, dare I say even in our churches. These are the ones that you will encounter probably more than any other. So I really want to camp out in moralistic therapeutic deism and explain that and process that together and kind of give us some keys, tips, tricks to pinpointing it, to recognizing it in ourselves, in others, in our churches, in our Bible studies, in our Sunday school classes, in our communities, in our homes, because chances are moralistic therapeutic deism has seeped into all of us somehow, or we know someone or around people for whom that kind of is their Christianity. Like we kind of label that as Christianity for a lot of people, and it's not really Christianity. So let's talk about deism for just a little bit here. Let's kind of process the 8 things. Again, I'm not seeking to re-explain the chapter, but I do want to highlight a few things so that they stay in our brains a little bit better as we process this together. So deism, the first question that he asks is, what does deism say is prime reality? Right? So what is ultimate? What is driving the machine? What is prime reality? So the deists, as you learned this week, or maybe as you were reminded this week, they assent to a God. They assent to some divine being. It does not have to be the Christian God. Did you pick up on that? Again, define your terms. Just God, just some energy, some being, some thing that has creative power. It could be a Christian God. It might not be a Christian God. It doesn't matter to a deist. It does not matter, which is important. It doesn't matter. It's just a God of some kind. They think it's a benevolent God, so it's not an angry deity necessarily. It's not a deity that is anti-humanity or anti-human. So you're avoiding some of the things that maybe you would come into contact with say, like a Greek pantheon or a Roman pantheon, where you have instances where the gods are upset at the humans, right? The humans do something the gods are displeased with. Humans act in a way contrary to what the gods would like them to do, and so the gods are angry, and then the gods interact with the humans. That is completely not a deist perspective at all. There's no angry deity. The deity is not even really involved in creation after the fact. So you have this impersonal being. They call it God. It's powerful, able to create life, able to kind of set things in motion. And for deists, that's it. This deity doesn't really ask much of us, right? There's no expectations really for how you will live, other than that you'll live within this closed loop system that they've created, that this deity has created. There's no real expectation on you because this deity doesn't really have a name or a face. This deity is not defined. So this God, whatever the deity, is the first cause. So this sets the world in motion, makes the world, makes the systems of the world, creates things like physics and gravity and gravitational pull and other scientific things and microbiomes and atoms and chemical reactions and creations and plants and all these things, and creates it so that it will sustain itself and that it will kind of roll and move through the universe. Makes it, sets it spinning on its axis, and steps back, right? Now, we are already so far from Christianity and even from the Hebrew scriptures at that point that it's not even funny, right? Like, we're so far away already from Christianity, now, here's the thing, which is why it's important for you and I to have a good understanding, a good doctrine of creation. And I don't mean, where do you fall on literal 7-day or evolution? That's not what I mean. We need to have, as Christians, a good understanding of why a creator and personal God matters. Why a God who is still involved in God's creation matters. Why a God who radically cares what happens in our world matters. You read Genesis 1-3, and it becomes very apparent very quickly that this God of the scriptures is very interested in what happens to and with his creation, right? This is not a deistic position. This is not a deistic God that the Bible proclaims. Right off the bat, literally within the first 3 chapters, it's become very apparent that the God of the Bible is not a deistic God. It's not the God that deists are holding to. So let's keep talking about this. It's not the God, the other things that we're not really going to dive deep into, but for deists, God is not triune, which at some point is a moot point because we've already determined that this is not the God of the Bible anyways. So that naturally follows. This God is not triune. This God is not personal. This God is not even really sovereign over human affairs because God doesn't really care to be sovereign over human affairs in a deistic worldview. God set the world spinning, created the systems for it to kind of operate, and says, I don't really care what happens after that. It's there, it's in motion, it's going, right? So that sets the scene for where we're going with conversations regarding deism. Go over to page 40. You get number 2, 3, 4, and 5 of this worldview kind of just really, really quickly. We're going to kind of sum it up. Again, the second question that this textbook asks of every single one of these beliefs or these practices is, what is external reality? What is true about what we see, what the world is like, what's happening, and what is true about external reality? And for deists, the cosmos that their God, again, not a Christian God, created is determined. Because it is created as a uniformity of cause and effect in a closed system, no miracle is possible. So let's stop right there for a second. Deists say that God, again, impersonal, non-Trinitarian, non-Christian God, set the world spinning, created the rules, created the regulations, created the laws of physics, created all of those things, set the world spinning and said, that's how it's going to be. So for a deist, there is never an inbreaking of supernatural acts within our world. There's never an inbreaking where suddenly water becomes wine and breaks all laws of everything, of science, right? That doesn't happen. Because it's a closed loop system, it's been created, and God's not interested in breaking into that space anyway, so it doesn't need to happen. We'll do questions in a little bit, yeah.
That's what you mean by closed loop system.
Yes, that's what we mean by closed loop system. Nothing is going to inbreak into it. It's going on its own, nothing's going to stop it. It's rolling and it's moving right along, okay? So you don't have miracles because you don't need miracles, because why do we need miracles if God's impersonal and if humanity is just kind of going on its own? They're not necessary for a deist. Deists don't even think that that's a thing that should happen. So there's no inbreaking of God's power. There's no inbreaking of the supernatural. There's no incarnation, right? Because that's a supernatural act. There's no water to wine. There's no multiplication of loaves and fishes. There's no resurrection. There's no need for a supernatural act. One, because God is not interested in the world anyways, really, after it's created. And two, because everything is kind of like determined, just it's going to go the way it's going to go, and God doesn't need to intervene. So it's created, it's uniform, and to a certain extent, Christians are like, okay, yeah, there's an order to the universe. Let's draw out some similarities, dissimilarities here. Christians would assert there is an order to the universe. God is a God of order, not chaos, right? Ancient readings of the creation narrative and of other narratives from more ancient type people and perspectives draw out the reality that what God is doing in Genesis and what God is doing throughout the scriptures in various places is bringing order out of chaos. That's the God that the Christians believe in. The Christians believe that our God is a God of order. Creation is an orderly thing, right? God did create systems. God did create laws of physics. God did create molecules and atoms. God did create these things. But Christians hold that God is still very interested in those things, right? Not that God just kind of created them and said no. And we also believe, a dissimilarity, that God actually has broken into God's creation multiple times throughout history and continues to do so in things like miracles, in things like the incarnation, the resurrection, things of that nature. Key elements of the Christian faith don't happen in a deistic position. They don't happen in a deistic world. Okay? Keep going. Take a look at number 3. What do deists think about human beings? So remember, these build on each other. So we've kind of talked about what God the deists believe in, what's external reality like. So therefore, what world have humans been placed in? The questions build on each other. Human beings, though personal, so we have the ability to have personal relationships according to deists. I mean, that's kind of self-evident, right? I feel like if someone starts telling you, yeah, we don't really have relationships, I mean, you could deal with like AI and stuff like that, sure, but it's kind of like, well, what are we doing right now? Like, is this not a relationship? So they believe that humans, we can have interpersonal relationships. Unlike the God that made the deistic world, we are in relationship, almost necessarily for our own survival, right? But even though we're personal, and even though we have personalities, and even though we have conversations, and we're working together, and we're kind of changing, we are still part of this clockwork, closed-loop system. So you get some deists who disagree with each other on a few things, and that's sometimes I'll talk with Christians, and they're like, see, the deists can't even get on the same page. And I'm like, have you met Christians? Like, that's not a good rebuttal against someone else's religion or system. Like, that's bad, like, not very good, like, mental practice there. Like, that's not a proof that it's a bad thing, right? I'm like, have you met Christians? Because you go talk to the Methodists or the Baptists or the Presbyterians or the Catholics, and you would think that you could just naturally disprove everything we say if you're going to hold that. So, but we do get some deists with more hardline deists and softer deists, or colder and warmer, I think is the language the book uses, talking about, okay, well, how predetermined are things? Christians have the same conversation too in some regards. How predetermined are our lives? Did you really get to choose the pair of shoes you put on this morning, or was that kind of built into the clock mechanism that was set in motion millennia ago? And everything is kind of like orchestrated at that moment, and you didn't really have a choice. You thought you had a choice, but you didn't. Christians have this conversation too, to be fair, right? But there are deists who are warmer and colder to what level of determinism are we dealing with? What level of you having a free will are we dealing with? Again, Christians have this conversation often too. But we are, regardless of how boiled down or how drilled down you want to be, or how, kind of big picture you want to be, humans according to deists are still we live within this clockwork universe that's going to run and move forward with or without you, really. It's not really about you at all, which I guess that's a similar thing with Christianity. It's not really ultimately about you. It kind of is with Christianity, but it also isn't. But yeah, so humans are great. We have personal relationships, but we're still just part of this moving system that's just always been moving and will continue on without us. That's kind of where they are. Okay, number 4, what about death? Again, these questions are building on each other, so we're coming from a base of what do we think about God? What do we think about reality? What do we think about humans? Therefore, what do we think about death? Deists are kind of like, well, yeah. Like, that's kind of it. Like, they're like, we don't know. Like, probably not. You have maybe what we would call like a hopeful deist who might hope that there is something beyond, but their position towards the world and towards human beings in general is not one of a definite, like, this is what happens after death, this is where it's moving. They're just not sure. They're kind of like, we don't really know. So again, you're going to have some that are warmer and colder on this position, saying, yeah, our souls or something is going to carry on, and other ones are like, no, you just die and that's it, and your body just becomes, it's very Lion King-esque, like, when we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass, so we are all connected in the great circle of life, right? So can I quote that entire movie? Maybe. I don't know. So, you kind of have warmer and colder deists on this position, but it's still not a very hopeful position in my opinion. Now, you have people that are deists that are very happy deists. So I think sometimes we as Christians, we get really disturbed or uncomfortable or sad or whatever when we're like, these people just seem so hopeless. Like, now, here's the deal. Maybe they aren't really, if they're really honest. Some people are just okay with this. And us being sad for them does not help. It does not help to just be like, that's just really depressing that they think, like, that's true. Maybe that is sad or depressing for us, and it makes us mean like, man, but it's not going to do anything if we're just be like, man, that's just really sad that people think that, and how do you grieve without hope? Like, that's a great question to ask yourself, but then we actually have to do something with that concern. And here's the other reality. And this has been something we've talked about for just, I feel like ad nauseum in Institute, is a lot of Christians that have really just not biblical, not actual Christian views on death anyway. So we're just as kind of like, woo, we float off into our spirit, and we're just like, yeah. No, that's not the biblical view either. And so Christians have just as many issues. Now we have hope, right? We believe that something is there. The Bible really talks about the actual resurrection of the dead. That's what Christians are going towards. But you guys know, we talk to a lot of Christians that you never even talk about the resurrection of the dead. And they're like, we just go to heaven when we die, right? So again, we have to know what we believe, and we actually have to have some backing for why we believe it before we can even look at another religion or another belief system or another worldview and say, okay, we got to talk about this. So just keep that in mind. Again, going back to the creation idea, how did the world come into being? We should have a robust theology of creation as Christians. We should have a robust theology of eschatology, of end things. We should have a robust understanding and the ability to articulate why we have hope in death. And it's not, we believe that we go to heaven when we die, right? So this is how we begin to build and have dialogue within these other systems that moves beyond us just being just really makes me sad that they don't have hope. It should make you sad that they don't have hope, but it should also then spur you on to process. It should spur me on to figure out, why do I actually have hope, and actually be able to go back to the Bible and talk about it intelligently, and then actually open my mouth and talk about it, right? Look at number 5. What is knowledge? What do they think about knowledge? How do we know things? What can be known? What is not knowable to humans? Through our innate and autonomous human reason and the methods of science, we can not only know the universe, but we can infer at least something of what God is like. The cosmos, this world, is understood to be in its normal state. It is not fallen or abnormal. I have some real big qualms with this one, probably more than I have qualms with the others. Obviously I have qualms with the others, but this one doesn't make logical sense in some ways. Because if deists are saying that, again, and here's where a lot of Christians get hung up with deism. The deists are not ascribing a Christian God. They're just saying some type of energy, some type of entity, some type of God, some type of all-powerful being created this and then step back. But they also are saying that the world is not fallen, the world is as it should be, and therefore we can ascertain at least something about this God through the world. That doesn't make sense with what they've said earlier. Logically, it doesn't hold water. Because if the world is not, for them, if the world is not in a fallen state, this is how it naturally is, then you have a pretty terrible God, right? And so, again, there's some inconsistencies. And you're going to have, again, and the book does a pretty good job of explaining and addressing, you're going to have some warmer theists or deists and some cooler theists. Golly, this is hard, deists and theists. deists when it comes to this. So you got to kind of know there's a spectrum. It's the same thing with Christianity. We exist kind of on the spectrum of belief about some non-essential things. Hopefully on the essentials we're united. But again, it's not good practice. It's not intellectual honesty for us to be like, they can't even get their story straight, so they're wrong. Christians we can't get our story straight either. Like, we struggle all the time with this. But we can know because of science, we can know because of observation of the world, things like that, which again, Christians will be like, yeah, I can know by observing, but if I actually want to really know something, I need to have it revealed to be my God. If I want to have wisdom, if I want to have actual like real knowledge about something, and the deists say, no, you can just kind of observe the world, science, things like that will reveal to you what is important. And again, you can kind of know what's going on, but it's a closed loop system, so it's going to keep moving on whether you acknowledge that or not, right? Okay, keep going. We're gonna wrap up these last 3 little points. On page 44, so where does this leave us when it comes to morality? Great question. Great question. I think we're all pretty concerned about that question. Does this belief system leave an open door for you to come in and like rob me of my possessions? Like, is it anything goes? Like, where are we at? I think that's a good thing for us to kind of determine. And so for deists, morality is intuitive or limited to general revelation because the universe is normal. It reveals what is right. Again, I have some real big questions about this because I see a lot going on in the universe that to me doesn't seem right. And so if I'm going to base morality off that, again, who is deciding this, right? Which is a great question. Who is deciding? Because if morality is intuitive, or if it's just limited, but let's just stick with if it's intuitive, and your guys are very smart. You can see where this is going. You can intuit one thing that I don't intuit, and so we're at odds when it comes to morality. You could intuit that it's totally fine for you to act in horrible, abusive ways because that's kind of what the animal kingdom does. We see that in nature. It's fine, right? Whatever. And I could, on the other hand, say, no, my moral system tells me this. And so we're at odds, and we have no higher authority. We have no system by which to appeal to deal with our confrontation, right? To deal with our situation. So you start having things like, and I mean, sometimes, we all have to boil down to like, well, what's the best for the majority? Stuff like that. But you still have this issue where you're going to eventually, I think we all experience this probably on a daily basis. You're going to bump into people. I'm going to bump into people who have different morals than I do, who have different intuitions about what is right and wrong than I do, right? And so with deists and with many other groups and belief systems, this is one of the things they struggle with, is what gets to determine what is right? What gets to determine morality? What gets to determine the ultimate answer to this problem or this disagreement, right? And again, this is not like some philosophical loophole where we're like, oh, gotcha, your whole system doesn't make sense. Christians have problems too. We have issues that we cannot figure out what to do with. And some Christians believe this and other Christians believe this, and we have the Bible. And we still can't figure out where we stand on certain things. So again, these are not loopholes for us to be intellectually dishonest and be like, gotcha. Like, no, like there are deists who would come in here and absolutely wreck us, absolutely tear us apart. But there's a tiny little thing that they have to reckon with that you can process with them if you ever get in a conversation to say, what gets to determine what right and wrong? That's a great question to ask. It's a great question to ask anyone in any belief system, in any worldview. What gets to determine right and wrong in your worldview, right? Number 7, history. For deists, history is linear. Again, the world is just moving along on the path that it was supposed to move on. So history is just kind of what happens as it moves, right? It's just, this is the path, this is the way, this is how it's moving. The course of the cosmos was determined at creation. It's set. Go back to that clockmaker imagery. All the pieces are set. All the pieces of the watch are set. The apparatus is in motion. The cogs are clicking and it's moving. The gears are moving, and that's just how it's going to be. And it's set in motion. Still, the meaning of the events of history remain to be understood by the application of human reason to the data unearthed and made available to historians. So deists are still interested in history. They're interested in seeing how things have played out. They care about it to a certain extent. All humans ultimately at some point care about history in varying degrees, to be sure, but the deists still care. They're not like, oh, whatever, it happened, it was predetermined, whatever. They're still interested in history. Again, I think all humans bear some type of interest in our history. But pure deists, again, cold deists, hardline deists, are gonna stick more towards history. It's predetermined to a certain extent. The system is closed. It's moving along. It's rolling forward, and this is just how it's going to be. Which again almost seems more hopeless than their view on the afterlife or lack thereof, right? That this is just how it is, and there's no hope for rescue. There's no hope to fix the broken systems, what we perceive as broken. Maybe that to me seems even maybe more sad than their views on death, because I think that views on death get swept up into that concept as well. Like, this is just how it is, and nothing we can do about it, and it's just rolling along. Now there are deists that you'll talk to and interact with who are very like hopeful, happy, joyful people. They're not like, well, it's just how it is, you know. But at kind of the base level, this is kind of like, let's just get a pulse on the situation. That's where they're coming from. Most of them. Again, there's caveats like there are with Christianity. Okay, so worldview number 8, the question that the eighth question this book asks on page 46 is, so what's the core commitment? What's the reasoning? It's kind of the big why question. It's processing out, what does this look like when the rubber meets the road, those types of things. And this is where we get the cold deism and the warm deism. Cold deists use their own autonomous reason to determine their goal in life. Warm deists may reflect on their commitment to a somewhat personal God and determine their goal in accordance with what they believe their God would be pleased with. So again, you have caveats within deism. You have some deists who are like, I'm my own person. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to do what I want to do. This is what I perceive to be right. This is what I perceive to be in line with kind of the flow of how the system of the world is going. And then you have warmer deists, people like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Ben Franklin, those types of people, who are warmer deists who believe in a God, and they may even believe that it might happen to be the God that we kind of see in the Bible, maybe, but I'm going to kind of make that make sense to myself, and then I'm going to use that to kind of form my own moralistic, thing, and that's what I'm going to do, right? So you get, as with anything almost, you get a spectrum of people across the line of cold deists to warm deists and everything in between. And the book does the best job it can, I think, in limited space, kind of giving you examples of those. I know it gets a little wordy in some places, and I know some of us are like, I don't understand all these words. That's okay. Especially that chapter on naturalism and some others, they're a little bit wordy. If you can get the 8 boxes down, that's great. Just if you're confused, or if you get it to a point in the reading, you're like, he went on about Marxism for like 4 chapters, and I don't understand anything he just said. Focus on those 8 boxes. Try to get those kind of figured out, and then proceed forward. Now, your textbook does you a kind service, starting on page 52, where it explains why deism doesn't make sense. Starting on page 52, anytime in a book like this, or in a book, like an academic book, where you have an author say something like this on page 52 at the top, what made and continues to make deism so unstable, ? The primary reasons, I think, are these, : and then you see words like first, second, third, fourth. That is like gold. That is a summary of everything they want you to believe. And if you're like me and you are reading, I don't even know how many books a week, and you have to kind of skip through and you can't really read all of them entirely, you look for this. This is good, smart reading. You underline those first, second, third, fourth, fifth sentences, and you get a more cohesive picture of what the author is doing. This is how you read a book. I know everyone's like, I know how to read a book. No, we don't. We are terrible readers. This is how you read a book. So first, if you didn't underline these already, let me encourage you, underline them. First, autonomous human reason replaced the Bible and tradition as the authority for the way ultimate reality was understood. I quibble with this. I quibble with this author's position and kind of the way he's orchestrated things, saying that and it's the way he goes about it. He presents his argument in such a way with the words he uses that Christianity was kind of like the norm and just accepted by everyone, and everyone loved it, and it was great, and everyone was a Christian, and then we started thinking too much, and we got all up in our brain, and you had like Enlightenment and postmodernism, and it just all went to pot. That's not the case. Like the world has never been Christian. Like that's the point. That's the point of Christianity, is that the world has never been Christian. Now you've had systems like Christendom, much like we have in the West, or it's going downhill, but much like Europe and the West experienced, where you had kind of Christian-esque ways of life, and people kind of just were happy to go about in systems that had been somewhat, maybe, possibly influenced by aspects of Christianity. The world has never been Christian. That's the point. That's the point of like heaven and earth, and how we need heaven to come to earth to help make the world Christian, to help make us into God's image more fully and more completely. That's the point. So to say that autonomous human reason replaced the Bible and tradition as the authority for the ultimate way, now, of course, there were by all means groups of people, churches, Christian communities, where the Bible and Christian tradition were the mainstays, were how we determine what was right and wrong. But I would argue that's not, like, it wasn't like the world was all believing the same thing, and all of a sudden, like, here comes Deism, just going to destroy Christianity. Like, that's not the case, right? I mean, even the founding of America was deist, not Christian, right? So stop coming at me with, well, this is a Christian nation. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. None the founding fathers that we love to like quote, they were deists. They weren't Christian. They weren't people that read the same Bible that we did. They weren't people who held to the same doctrines that we do. They would not be at your church. So no, like that's it. We didn't come, like the world wasn't Christian, and then all of a sudden like deism and the Enlightenment and postmodernism, all this stuff like ruined it. Now, were there more Christian communities? Probably, yes. Was the world more sympathetic to a Christian position? Absolutely. Were Christians more accepted in different spheres like academia and science? Sure, yes, it's definitely changed. But let's make sure that we don't have a mentality of like, I just wish we could go back to the good old days where everyone was a Christian. It's never existed. It's never existed. That's the point. Okay, so second, autonomous human reason replaced the Bible and tradition as authority for morality. So again, I quibble with this, but you are dealing with a majority that would be okay with, yeah, we're okay with Christian morals. We're okay with kind of like going along with that. We may not be Christian ourselves, but we're okay with that. We're not going to argue with you about it. To actually beginning to have people stand up and say, I disagree with this, and here's why. You start having people have more of a voice, and so they want to set up autonomous human reason, replacing the Bible, or replacing other ethical standards that have been kind of used for a while with their own autonomous human reason, with their own, this is what I want, this is what I think. And the author goes on to explain how this eventually turns out to be what the author calls a false hope. Why? Because we begin to have things like World War I and World War II. We begin to have things like the Cold War, where we begin to realize, oh, maybe it's not so good for us to get to determine what's right and wrong. Maybe humans actually lack the capacity in and of ourselves to make this thing run well. So World War I, World War II, Cold War, Great Depression even, began to do really intense damage to some aspects of deism and other similar belief systems and worldviews when people began to realize, oh, humans actually aren't all that great. We're really, really good at killing each other, but we're really not great when it comes to like morals. So that kind of went downhill. Third, fourth, fifth, you can read those. What I want to draw your attention to is at the bottom of page 53. He quotes Etienne Gilson at the bottom and says, for almost 2 centuries, the ghost of the Christian God has been attended by the ghost of Christian religion, a vague feeling of religiosity, a sort of trusting familiarity with some supreme good fellow to whom other good fellows can hopefully apply when they are in trouble. That is Christendom. That is Christendom. That is the one of the most harmful things that we as Christians have to deal with in the world. Is this idea that there's just like a Christian-esque like layer to everything. And that we're kind of born into a Christian country, or we're born into a Christian home, or we're born into a Christian system. No, you're not. You're born into a world that has been torn asunder by sin. You're not born into a Christian anything. You might be born to Christian parents. That's about as close as you're going to get, but that doesn't make you a Christian, right? And so what we have here is we have this, I love the way Etienne says this ghost of the Christian God attended by the ghost of Christian religion that just kind of permeated everything a little bit and kind of made people feel like, oh yeah, I go to church on Sundays. Great. Or yeah, our mayor is a Christian, or my parents were Christian, or the majority of our town goes to church on Sundays, or we all get our buggies together and we go and we do that and we celebrate Christmas and it's great. This is not Christianity, right? So you have the ghost of Christian God attended by the ghost of Christian religion, and here's how the Etienne explains this. This is a vague feeling of religiosity. Again, you have I go to church on Sundays. I'm a good person, right? I'm nice to other people. I read my Bible. Okay? A sort of trusting familiarity with some supreme good fellow to whom other good fellows can hopefully apply when we are in trouble. And this is where we're going to step off into talking about moralistic therapeutic deism, which I would argue is probably one of the hardest, most pervasive things that you and I will come in contact with here in the West. I would preach a different sermon if I was not in a church of our setting in our location, right? But for you and I, this is what we're going to come in contact with. Take a look at page 51. Take a look at page 51. In 2005, some sociologists got together and they decided we're going to run a test, we're going to do an experiment, we're going to do some research on what exactly, and they kind of really focused on teenagers. What exactly are teenagers believing about God and about Christianity in the world, right? Now, here's the thing that I just really want to say, and I always want to say this when we talk about things like this. The youth get a real bad rap. We give the youth a hard time. When we're like, look, the youth are just all over the place. They're deists, right? They're moralistic therapeutic deists. They're not Christians. Who parented those youths? We laugh, but it's a serious question. Who parented those youths? Who parented them? Because their parents clearly didn't when it comes to the things of God. We're dealing with the same thing now, where we have students who we're like, why are the students leaving the church when they go to college? Parents? Tell me. They were in your home for 18 years. Every day. They were at church for maybe 3 or 4 days a month. I get a little hot and bothered when we start talking about this because it's not the youth's fault that they're giving these answers. This is what we've fed them. What we've done is we've given them pizza and kickball and then a 5-minute sermon, and we've said, now you know Jesus. Come to camp with us. We're going to play kickball and go swimming and go horseback riding and play all these games, and then we'll worship in a really dark room with some fog, and we'll make you have all these feelings for 30 minutes, and then we'll give a 15-minute talk. We'll have you crying. Come down to the front. Now you're a Christian. And we never disciple them, and we never expect them to grow in the faith. These students understand calculus. They can do intense math problems. They can do physics. They can do chemistry. And yet we never expect them to move beyond pizza, kickball, and a 5-minute devotional. And so when we come to this and it's like, oh, they interviewed teenagers in 2005 and they gave these answers and we're like, the youth are just out of control. Who's shepherding them? Who's shepherding them? This is why we get these answers. Take a look. Here's the worldview of the youth in 2005, and I would say this has not changed much. And since this was the worldview of the youth in 2005, this is now the worldview of adults in 2022. Number one, they summed up their worldview like this. They believe in a God, that a God exists who created and orders the world and watches over human life on earth. Okay, most of us are like, sure, I'm on board. I might want to say a little bit more about what kind of God this is, but I can roll with this, okay? Okay. Number two, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other as taught in the Bible and by most religions. Okay, we're like, Okay, sure, again, I might want to give some more context to that and kind of direct it more, but okay, we haven't lost him entirely yet. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about one's self. I would argue that number 3 happens because we have a really hard time, and we just borderline don't do it, with adults either. We don't teach our students, we don't teach our adults about the holiness of God. We don't teach people about the holiness, the uniqueness, the otherness of God, and why God is worthy of our worship and our loyalty and our allegiance. And we don't teach people that this God has come to do something in and for and through the person, through them, for them rather, through the person of Jesus, who is God. We don't explain the story well, right? We don't explain the overarching themes of the scriptures well. We don't give our students, we don't give our adults a story big enough for them to live in. We just give them little tiny ideas and warm fuzzy feelings and a lot of pizza, and we say, go for it. Number 4, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life except when God is needed to resolve a problem. Part of this is modeled by us as adults to our youth. Right? They don't see mom and dad like regularly. They don't see other adults in their lives. They don't see people that they interact with regularly talking about God. They don't hear their parents in the home talking about God. They don't even really hear sometimes youth leaders actively talking about, here's what my life with God actually looks like. And so in their brains, the only time we need to talk about God is when we're not doing so well. Right? I'm really struggling in school, and your parents are like, well, let's pray about that. You should pray about that. That's great. But if that's really the only time that your kids see prayer happening in the home is if something is going wrong, then we're missing a connection, right? We're missing a connection. We're not forming ourselves as adults. We're not forming our youth. So they are left with this assumption that God must not be really overly important except when things are going bad, or except when I'm sick, or except when I'm sad, or except when I didn't get the part in the school play, or I didn't make the sports team, or when my friend was really mean to me, or I didn't get into the college that I wanted to get into, right? So therefore, number 5 is almost a natural conclusion of this, that good people go to heaven when they die, and there's no requirement, there's no need for an actual relationship with the God of the universe, and therefore a robust understanding of how you fit into God's story. This is why I harp just go on and on about the importance of the Christian story, the importance of the story of the Bible, and for us to have a robust, deep understanding of how, from Genesis to Revelation, God is telling a story that we are included in and that we are called joyfully to be a part of. And that this God is actually, again, going back to the point number 1 about what do they think about creation, that this God who created the world is still deeply involved in it and knows you and made you and loves you and has things for you to do and wants to include you in this story, right? And so the church, when I say we, I mean the church, we've done a poor job of communicating the story and then of expecting people to be able to go deeper, which is why I love what we're doing here, right? Like we kind of we do it to adults, which is why it's trickled down to our students. We give adults a lot of times kind of an entertaining, couple of songs and then a little bit of teaching, and we're like, okay, go for it. And if that's all we're ever getting, and we're never getting down deep into the weeds, and we're never kind of being like, okay, what does that actually mean for my life, right? Then there's disconnect. And so it's important for us to do the intellectual work of making those connections, right? And especially if you're a parent, of modeling that for your kids. If you're not a parent, I'm not a parent, but then of helping other people figure out what that looks like, right? And no one's going to do this perfectly, which is why we have community, which is why you have friends, which is why you want your kids around other believers, around other parents who are believers so that they can see it in other people's lives too. I'm not saying we just all become this homogenous group of believers and we never talk with the outside world. That's not what I'm saying. But this study that was done in 2005 kind of led to the idea of this moralistic therapeutic deism. If I'm good and I act right, and I behave, and I'm nice, and I'm fair to other people, and I'm just generally a good person, that'll make me feel good, right? And so God really only exists, or it really is only needed if I'm not feeling good, So I need some like therapy. I need this moralistic, I'm good, therapeutic, kind of getting some therapy from God, deism. I don't really think God's overly involved in the rest of my life. That's how that phraseology kind of came about. And therefore, I'm pretty autonomous. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know a lot of people like this. We know a lot of people like this who believe in a God, may even believe in the Christian God, right? They may even be people who go to church or who are in a Bible study or something, and they're like, yeah, I do this because I want to be a good person. I want to be a good Christian, and this helps me, be good. This helps me kind of learn how to be a better person. And so, but my life doesn't look any different than it would if you took God away, really, except I would know who to call when something went bad. That's a lot of people we know. Dare I say that's a lot of people we know who would probably have call themselves Christians. Again, going back to this idea that God exists, but God created me, and I'm meant to be nice and good, and that'll make me happy. And if I ever find myself in a place where I'm not happy or I'm having a hard time being nice or good, I just talk to God, and then that's it, right? But the story of God never becomes my story. I never find myself swept up in the grand narrative that the scriptures are explaining, right? And again, this is not just a problem with youth. This is a problem with adults that adults deal with because the youth of 2005 are now the adults of 2022, and so on and so forth, and it goes and just kind of goes and goes and goes. And now those youth are parenting children. And so we are caught in this loop where we have to break out of moralistic therapeutic deism. We have to remind people that having good ethics does not make you a Christian. Good ethics is not Christianity. Being nice or being a good person or having morals is not Christianity. Only talking to God when something goes wrong or when you're sad or upset is not Christianity. Ascertaining or even saying that the Christian God of the Bible exists is not Christianity. And this is where it gets hard for us and the rubber meets the road a little bit because we know people who are like this. We have probably in different seasons of our lives kind of tampered and kind of gone back and forth across that line, right? Which is why I'm so convinced that moralistic therapeutic deism is one of the biggest challenges to Christianity in the West today. It's not, other religions are going to, prove us wrong and take all our people. It's not like, everyone's just going to, go do their own thing. Or it's not like, that person's in political power now, so they're just going to ruin morality. No. It's within. It's already built in. We will destroy ourselves with moralistic therapeutic deism more so than anything else could probably destroy us, is my argument. You might disagree. You might have a different perspective. That's totally fine. But from my experience, both personal and just working in full-time ministry, this is the big ticket item. This is the one that we have to have an answer for. We have to have a better story to tell than, God wants you to be happy and nice and good and live a good life and be good to other people. And if you ever need anything, you can pray about it. Is that part of the story? Yes. But if we boil the story down to that, rather than boiling the story down to, by the way, Jesus is king, and that has radical implications for your life. Those are two very different stories. One of them is the gospel. One of them is not. Does this one about being a good person, being nice, being a good citizen, being a good, decent human being who prays when they need something, is that part of the story? Absolutely. Was that all the story? No. Okay, I know that I got a little fired up there. But I'm just really convinced that this is important, and I hope that maybe you can kind of see that it's important too. Let's process it a little bit together. Questions, comments. Maybe you've seen some of this kind of work out in your life or in your community or something, and you have a practical illustration. That would be great too. Can we get Tracy one of the mics? I think there's a mic on this table. Just flip that switch up, and we'll start going.
Okay, I have two quick questions.
Go for it.
First, quick question. Is deism the same as Unitarian? Is Unitarian Universalism deism?
Let me backtrack in my brain a second.
Would that be considered modern day deism?
My inclination is to say no, but with a caveat of saying there is definite overlap. Yeah, cold deism would be more of that, but there's definitely some overlap, and I have a feeling Clay will actually talk about that a little bit next week when he talks about naturalism, and then the next chapter after that, what I can't remember, nihilism. I think that'll come up a little bit. There's definitely overlap, especially with the colder leaning types of deism.
Okay.
But yeah,
I
I don't know that I would equate
that's a
them.
Unitarian
Yeah.
forever, and that's cold. Okay. Secondly, if morality is intuitive to deists, how did we end up with such a good, you don't know what I'm going to say, how did we end up with such a good constitution and country that we live in if our founding fathers were deists and morality is intuitive? I don't understand, except by the grace of God, how we ended up in the best country on earth. If
you think it's the best country on earth.
Well, okay, all right, okay. Well,
Again, it's very, very, very biased position.
all right, okay. Well, we do have a pretty dang good system of government, and and we do have a darn good constitution.
Okay.
I think. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I have been told that it's pretty darn good, and it is. I think that we live in a pretty good country. So all of that to say, it's amazing to me that most of those people, if they were true deists and morality was sort of willy-nilly, like that's amazing to me. And I'm right there with you. I've known for years. It's not a new thing to me that they weren't, fundamental Christians. So, what do you, how?
Do we all agree in here that killing people is wrong? Yeah. Do we all agree that you should probably not run a red light? No. You should probably not run a red light. Do we all agree that you should not steal? Do we all agree that you should, to the best of your ability, not impinge on the welfare of other people? I've said nothing about a Christian God, and we've all agreed on these things, right? So I think that, there's other countries in the world, right? So, you have places like Spain and Portugal and other places in Europe. You have places in Central South America that are doing well, other places that aren't. You have Canada, you have other places, right? That are doing just as well, and if you look at the data on just general welfare, happiness, longevity, doing actually quite much better than we are in many ways. So it just depends on what we're labeling as success and what we're labeling as that. Now, do we have a great country? Absolutely. Absolutely, we have a great country. Do we have a country that affords many more freedoms than were normal for the time period in which things were drawn up? Absolutely. Absolutely we do. I don't necessarily attribute that to they were all Christians and so we did it. Because other countries have great systems of government and seem to be doing much better if you look at the data just when they go up to citizens and do interviews of general happiness, longevity, lifespan, healthcare, things like that.
You just said when it was drawn up, like in the late 1700s, I don't know if you could say the same thing of Spain and Europe and the European colonies.
I would argue that ask an African American back in the day if it was really that great. Ask slaves if it was really that great when it was drawn up. Things. So we look at it and we're like, oh, it's great. It's great for us now. Again, I love our country. I think proud to be here.
You're answering my question.
Yeah,
I'm kind of saying it tongue in cheek.
Right. I know. We've talked a little bit about it. Yeah.
That's what's so amazing to me, that I think it was a little bit God's grace, and that it is just it's just fascinating.
Yeah.
That you said when you said morality is intuitive, and I read it too. It's just it literally just hit me like a ton of bricks.
Yeah. Pat.
Not to be a real constitutionalist, but if you think about it, when they wrote the laws, they left all the things very specific to human behavior at the state level. So the framework of it is we're going to have a very limited topside government, and we're going to let the states pick it. And you can, abortion is the number one thing we're having a fist fight over the entire country over in state by state basis, because they can look at it and say, you know something, these people over here can see that different from over there. They built that mechanism in, right? And so they were smart that way, and being deist that way and looking at it, but they didn't come in and legislate any morality really in the topside document. It's almost empty of that. By design, in my opinion, because they thought different people in different groups are
They had
gonna
seen
have
it go
different
poorly.
interpretations.
They had seen it go poorly before, like in England at the time, right? So they're like, we're going to avoid some of that, right? Okay, what else about deism, moralistic therapeutic deism, anything like that? Yeah, I think there's a mic at your table, actually. You might have to turn that one on.
You said something about that I was thinking about last week that kind of touches on the whole approach that we're taking. So I'm not sure if there's a real question here, but the premise, which I was trying to find, I'm pretty sure he said it in the introduction, which you said, which is the whole premise of the way he presents these worldviews is that Christianity is kind of where everything comes from. Like he doesn't quite say it this way, but he kind of does imply we were all Christian and then things started to change. So I'm a Christian. I'm going to start with Christianity. And then it's kind of like we're going to measure everything against that. And I guess, again, maybe it's not so much a question, but to me, I mean, I get it. It's still helpful to understand all of these. But that doesn't really seem super compelling when I think apologetics in the sense of I'm going to try to critically explain my faith to someone else. And by that conversation is, by definition, with someone that's probably not bought into that view.
Exactly.
That
No,
we
I
all
completely
were
agree with you.
Christian and then
I
everything
completely
went-
agree with you.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
So-
yes. No, I completely agree with you. The textbook, at least he's honest about where he's coming from, right? So he's writing from a Christian perspective, assuming that Christians are his audience, and he starts with Christian theism as the base, and then works to explain the other worldviews based off starting with Christian theism, right? Which again, I would welcome textbook recommendations. It's hard to find a book that covers a lot, so at some point we're at the mercy of the publishers. But at some point, I completely agree with you where I don't know how intellectually honest it is to start that. I think it's good for us to know what we believe. And so what we mean by starting from that, of course, you should know what you believe before you start trying to figure out what everyone else believes. And that's going to be a journey, right? Those things can kind of happen simultaneously sometimes. But do keep in mind as you read this book, and as you kind of explore these other positions, that he is writing from a Christian perspective. Now he's not putting a Christian spin on these things, right? He's not even really. Well, I guess he is. He does try to kind of poke holes in them in some ways, but kind of keep that in mind as you read. And I would encourage you, if one of these really grabs you, like if there's a chapter you're like, man, that was really interesting, I want to go deeper, do some further research, start kind of looking at other things, reading other things on that specific thing. Dare I say, read things by people who ascribe to that worldview. That's where the rubber's going to meet the road, is when you start reading actual, like, now, finding a deist these days is a little bit different because it's kind of not in vogue, but you can find New Age people, you can find Eastern religion that are writing actively about their faith. You find their YouTube channel, listen to them, hear what they're saying, not from Christianity being behind it or being the lens through which it's talked about, right? This book will get your feet wet a little bit and kind of like launch you, but it's not going to help you get down into the weeds of that. So yeah, good point. Yes, David.
I wanted to get back to the morality thing. When you're talking about innate or inborn, I think of creation, that God created us with an inborn sense of what's right and what's wrong. Okay. But also, I believe there is a God-revealed standard so that the sense of what's right and wrong isn't necessarily something that we created.
Yeah.
It has to do with a standard that God has revealed to us, and we talk about the Bible, and the Bible kind of helps us in getting that revealed standard. but that morality is a combination of those things. If you believe in the Christian God, then you got to believe in the revelation of that moral standard. I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there was one other thing that I wanted to. This is completely different.
Go for it. We're gonna
different subject.
Go for it.
And it has to do with whether you have a depressed feeling or not a depressed feeling. I'm coming from a science background. One of the basic standards of science is the second law of thermodynamics, that basically everything's running down. This universe is going to come to an end. It was created, Big Bang, bam, it created, okay. But it's going to come to an end.
Yep.
There's no such thing as eternal life in a situation like that.
Yeah.
And if there is such a thing as eternal life, and there is such a thing as an open system instead of a closed system, how did the fall create the second law of thermodynamics?
Yeah.
It's
a great question.
And the deists have to work with that, and I guess the naturalists have to work with it also.
It's a great question, yeah. And for Christians, that comes down to, do you believe God created a perfect world or a good world, right? So is the second law of thermodynamics built into creation naturally by God, and then God is going to work to undo that? Or is the second law of thermodynamics a result of the fall, right? Like it's a great question. It's a great question. And Christians, of course, are all over the map on how we respond to that. But that is definitely a question, one that Christians have to kind of process, because it determines what we think about eschatology. It determines about what we think about Jesus's revealing work in the world, and what actually is, because we're told that the ultimate result of sin is death. Right? So death of us physically as human beings, death of creation, death of our world, death of our universe. I mean, you can take this out as macro as you want, which the second law of thermodynamics would kind of indicate to us, right? So it's a great question that worldviews have to deal with and process. Now deists would say, that's just how the system is built to eventually run down. I'm guessing that's how they would respond to that. But again, we all have to account for that reality, and what is, for Christians, how is God going to counteract that law? Yeah, it's a great point. Anyone else? I'm going to, maybe one or two more, and then we're going to do some group discussion. Yes? Can we get the other mic on? There, maybe?
Is that on?
There
now?
you go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I have a question that's kind of a takeoff of Jeff's. And, you go through the isms, and they seem simple, and they get more confused, and get more confused, and get more confused. And I read through them, and I say, well, there's an idea that's probably okay in deism, or here's an idea in nihilism. So what's to keep me from coming up with my own worldview and answer all those questions any way I want and call it a legitimate worldview? In other words, is there a right? This author says the right worldview is a Christian, but who's he to say that?
Yeah, and that's the question.
Don't we all have to answer that for ourselves?
Yes, we do. And you are free to come up with your own religion, your own worldview, your own cult. I mean, people have been doing this for forever. Like, this is what we are naturally bent towards, making something that we want to work for ourselves. Like, that's just kind of what we do, which is one reason you do have so many worldviews. Which is one reason we have all those wonderful, fascinating, just really gripping documentaries on Netflix about all the different cults, things of that nature. This is what people have been doing forever, is we take our own thing, we kind of build our own system. We're like, I like a little bit of this, a sprinkle of this, a dollop of this, and a cherry on top, and now I have my worldview. And it just looks like me, right? It kind of affirms everything that I want to feel, and it makes me feel good, and I like it. It doesn't demand anything of me. But that's the great temptation of humanity. I mean, that's Adam and Eve, is they're creating their own worldview. They're saying, I don't like this rule book, this way of looking at things, this way of operating. I'm going to do my own thing. That's the great kind of temptation of all of us, is to just generate our own worldview and say, this is what I want to do, which is why there's so many. Carolyn, and then we'll be done. One more question over here. Can we get Carolyn a mic? And then we will move on to our last thing.
So, Laurien, I wanted to go back to happiness versus contentment.
Yeah.
And so, as a Christian, we have somebody else that we believe really has authority over us.
Yeah.
And so, given that, I can't, if I'm a true Christian, go off and do whatever, a little dollop of this and a little dollop of that. I mean, I have a purpose here on life. And to be quite honest, it's not always easy to live that life.
No. Yeah.
But if I live in a world where I can have a little dollop of this and a little dollop of that and a cherry on the top, then yeah, I might be a lot happier because I'm not living to this different life. And I did read the other chapter, as you know, by my email.
Right, I did. I saw it.
What I'm struggling with is, as people have all these little different worldviews, it makes it really hard to rub along together, especially when you're a Christian and your worldview comes from this book.
Yeah.
And I'm not, now I can admit there are different ways to interpret it.
Sure.
But there's some fundamental things in here that I should not do.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, and I mean that's just I think you're saying what we all struggle with, right? Is how do we think and act and be Christian, and how do we act Christianly in the world where everyone around us, their natural inclination is to kind of do the ice cream sundae bar worldview, kind of this, I have my own thing now, right? So how do we process, how do we interact? And you're exactly right, Carolyn. It's very hard to do this. I would point us toward Paul in the New Testament, where Paul does this really well, where he knows his audience. So think about his sermon and his discussion at Mars Hill, when he talks to different people throughout his missionary journeys. He knows his audience. Now, some of us would be like, well, how are we supposed to know what our audience is? Everyone kind of does their own thing. You can kind of get a read a little bit on, okay, these people are more in this, especially if you're talking like, doing a debate or talking with someone who's a very clear X, Y, or Z. But Paul has a general understanding of just humanity, right? In our kind of state of rebellion and our just desire to be our own gods or desire to do whatever. And he understands his audience. He understands, this is a more Jewish audience. This is a more Gentile audience. This audience is more inclined if I use some Greek mythology or Greek poetry, like they're going to track with me better. So when it comes to like how do we do Christian life in a world where everyone around us seems to have that, ice cream sundae, I'll take a little bit of this with cherry on top. I think one, recognizing that just be aware that most of the time you come into contact with people, don't assume they're Christian. Don't assume that. And then the other thing is, we have to get better at conversation and of not being easily offended, which is hard. It's really hard to not be easily offended, right? But Paul was really good at this when he just jumps into conversation. And here's my practical little piece for this. And you can take the 8 questions that this book outlines. Those are good 8 questions to have kind of in your back pocket. You might want to reword them because they're a little bit kind of academic sounding. But when we come in a conversation with people and we're trying to advocate for the Christian faith or process that with people or be good listeners, we also need to be good question askers, right? And that will draw out, if you're wondering, I don't really know what this person thinks about this, ask them. And you can ask an indirect question. You can ask kind of like, well, what do you think happens when we die? Or what do you think about, X, Y, or Z? Or why are we here? Like, why do you think humans exist? And do you have a purpose in life? Like, those types of general kind of, they seem threatening a little bit, but they're not really. Just to ask someone like, hey, do you think that you individually have a purpose in the world? Like, why are you here? And then kind of move them, especially if they're going to come, I just kind of, through just create, evolution or through just the natural process of the world, here I am. It's like, okay, if they're going that way, then be like, but do you have a purpose? Like, why are you here? Things of that nature, right? Those will help us kind of begin to identify like which ice cream flavor they're picking for their ice cream sundae, and do they have whipped cream on there, or do they have a banana? Like, you'll kind of like figure that out as you ask questions. So my encouragement is to figure it out by asking questions, but also just to recognize, like Karen, it's hard. Like, it's okay to admit that these are hard things to process and hard conversations to have sometimes. But here's what I will say, and then I want to do some other stuff, is the more we do it, the more we exercise those muscles, the more willing we are to be uncomfortable, it'll get easier. It's like working out, right? It's like adopting any habit. The more we have the conversations, the more willing we are to do the learning, the more willing we are to kind of push off the moralistic therapeutic deism and say, I actually want to understand, and I want to be involved in this story, and I want to have a role to play in it, and I really believe that I do have a role to play in it by the grace of God, those types of things. And we begin to kind of take those little steps. It becomes easier. It's never going to be like, oh, it was a great day being a Christian. I just nailed everything today, right? Like, that's not even really the goal. The goal is just to slowly over time be formed more and more into the image of Christ. And then remember also that the New Testament also tells us that we have to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. We have to learn how to think differently about things. We have to learn how to adopt the mind of Christ. We have to learn how to reframe our understanding of the world and its systems and who we are and why we are and what we are and who God is and what God is and why God is, and all of those things have to be reformed, be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And obviously something happens in our hearts, right? We're told that we're given hearts of flesh instead of hearts of stone, but we're also that something has to happen in our minds, like in the seat of our will even. Something has to shift and change. And that transformation, typically, especially for relearning and unlearning things, happens gradually over time. We believe that we're sanctified, right? We believe we're declared righteous, but like that getting worked out and us realizing that and living into that more fully and being shaped more into the image of Jesus takes time. So with that, let me pause.